Hello, ladies. Today we are going to be talking about natural selection. Last class we dealt with artificial selection, and we talked about how selection is humans selecting the traits most desirable for a species. Natural selection is going to be just a little bit different when we talk about how the traits are chosen. So today's objectives, by the end of this lesson, um, the things you're going to do, you're going to explore the conditions that cause natural selection to occur, and you're also going to analyze what Darwin's ideas on evolution tell us about living and extinct species. So when we talk about Darwin, he was really influenced by the four gentlemen we talked about last class. And after he read Malthus's ideas on population and growth, he started putting things together in the fact that more individuals are produced than can survive, and they start competing for resources. And he described this struggle as a struggle for existence because you're literally fighting for your life. Um, if you think about large litters of puppies or kittens, there's usually a runt. Now, out in the wild, those runts would have to try to compete to survive with its brothers and sisters. But we have taken it upon ourselves to, when we adopt, sometimes we like to get the runt of the family, and we like to get the smaller puppies because they're cuter. So we're actually kind of going against what natural selection says and what the struggle for existence is. But that doesn't mean that some species don't still exhibit this. So Darwin knew that individuals have some sort of natural variation of different heritable traits. And what he did was essentially he assumed that some of these different variations are going to make them better able to survive in whatever environment they're in. So when you talk about claws or claw length or how sharp they are, that is a heritable trait for some birds. And small variations may help a certain bird survive better than others. Speed, um, height, those kind of things are all different traits that are going to affect survival. And those natural variations could increase people's chances to survive in their environment. So when we talk about adaptation, remember this is the exact slide we had during our lab when we taped our thumbs. Our thumbs were an adaptation that we developed that ended up being a huge, great thing for us because we can grip things, we can build things. But an adaptation is defined as a heritable characteristic that increases an organism's ability to survive in an environment. And this concept is extremely important when it comes to evolution, natural selection, artificial selection, all that. And when we talk about adaptations, they happen over a very long period of time. And the traits that are needed for survival are going to be passed down because when you talk about adaptations, they are heritable characteristics, meaning they have to be something that you can get from your mom or your dad or another species can get from its parents. And this is really going to be that driving factor behind evolution. So here we have three different examples of adaptations. The top left picture here, if you look hard enough, you can actually see a fish. Its eye is just about right in the middle of the screen, and its mouth is just off to the right of the picture, okay? Right in the middle as well. So camouflage is huge adaptation for many species to survive. If you look on the right, we see what's called imitation. And this is when a safe species will imitate a more dangerous one so it doesn't get messed with. So I don't know if any of you all ever did camping or did what's it called, Girl Scouts, but there was a saying whenever you're out in the woods, red touches yellow, kill a fellow. So if you go by that, the top snake, red touches yellow, kill a fellow, that means the top one is dangerous. But then there's also another saying, red touches black, friend of Jack. So the one on the bottom is actually the non-poisonous snake. But you can see how they look very, very similar. And personally, I don't want to stick around long enough to sit there and look at its back. I see the snake, I am running. So the bottom one, this is kind of that complex I talked about some classes where, if you ever know a high school guy that is getting ready to uh, get into a fight or an argument with another guy, one thing that guy generally does is puffs up his chest and acts all manly and says something like, What, you want to go, bro? And this is essentially actually a survival technique that has been passed down. And if you look right here at the bottom, you see a little fox in the background, and you see this large bird puffing up its wings and making it look like a much larger animal. The goal of this is that the fox essentially will see this and say, No, I don't want to mess with him, and run away. So these are just three different adaptations that we see in the wild and in nature. Now, this is one really important thing Darwin said was this idea of survival of the fittest. And essentially, what he said was that the differences in adaptations are going to affect an individual's fitness. And fitness does not refer to how in shape you are at all. Instead, it refers to how well an organism can survive and reproduce in its environment. So, what this means is if you have high fitness, that means you are very well adapted to your environment. And you're going to be able to survive and pass on your traits more readily than someone who does not have high fitness. Um, so, when we talk about survival, too, remember survival is more than just staying alive. To be a successful species, to be a successful individual organism in the world, survival is going to also include reproducing and passing on your traits successfully, those good traits. So, with survival of the fitness, with all these adaptations, we can come to the conclusion of this thing called natural selection. And a book definition is process by which organisms with variations most suited to their local environment survive and leave more offspring. So, natural selection essentially means the ones better fit to survive are going to survive in nature and in the wild. The ones who do not have high fitnesses are going to die. So only certain individuals in a population are going to produce new individuals. And remember, in artificial selection, it was actually the humans that chose the successful traits and the ones that are passed on. Natural selection, it's all nature or the environment that chooses the successful trait. And one example we are actually going to explore in class a little bit is a grasshopper example. So imagine you are in a field of green grass and you have green and brown grasshoppers. Now, if you were a bird, you would easily see the brown grasshoppers stick out versus the green. So, in that environment, the green grasshoppers will survive and reproduce more readily. So, we're definitely going to explore that in class and do a fun little activity on the smartboard with this. But just be aware that natural selection, it's going to be nature or the environment that chooses the successful traits that get passed on. So, natural selection is going to occur whenever there are more individuals that are born than can survive. This idea of struggle for existence. It's going to occur when there's going to be a natural heritable variation, and that's the variation in adaptation stuff we talked about. And it's also going to occur where there is a variable fitness among individuals, and that's where we get to our survival of the fittest. So all the things we talked about today pulls into natural selection and what it is. So struggle for existence, variation and adaptation, and survival of the fittest. So well-adapted individuals are going to survive and reproduce in their respective environments. And populations are going to continue to change over time as they become better adapted to their environment. And we're going to talk next chapter about how it's not individuals that evolve, but actually populations. And this is one reason why. Those traits get passed on generation after generation until a population can evolve. So natural selection acts only on inherited traits. That is very important to remember. It's because those are the only characteristics that parents can pass on to their offspring. If it's a trait that you acquire that you cannot pass on, then natural selection will not work on that trait. One thing to remember as well, natural selection, to go against some of the other works that Darwin read, is not perfect. We are not making an organism more perfect. The whole point of natural selection is the process of helping them survive and reproduce better in its local environment. So some traits that we have or other organisms might have were once adaptive but may no longer be useful. We don't need it. Our appendix is an example of that. We're going to look at other structures that other organisms have. Next lesson 16.4, that show that they don't need that trait anymore. It's just not there. They don't use it. And a lot of traits may become adaptive over time. It's going to depend on the local environment in which the organism lives. And to kind of wrap a lot of this up over the next couple slides, Darwin pretty much proposed that over all these generations, adaptation could cause different species to evolve into new species. So those successful species that lived are going to change and make new species. And when we look at every single organism today, every single organism is descended from some parent that survived and passed on their traits to them. So when we look at what's called common descent, this is his proposal that all living species are descended with some sort of modification from a common ancestor, which is called descent with modification. So the descent of man is that picture where we see a monkey-like creature at the far left, and slowly there's 4 or 5 other little humanoid creatures before we get to an upright walking man. And Darwin based these ideas on the fact that the Earth is millions of years old, and he also used the fossil record to help his discoveries and prove this. So to kind of illustrate his ideas and show all of this, he drew the very first evolutionary tree. And you're going to hear a couple different words for the tree of life or the evolutionary tree. You'll also hear it called the phylogenetic tree. Okay? And he said that, for example, all tigers, panthers, and cheetahs share some common ancestor. And he also said that all dogs come from an ancestor of wolves. He said if you go back far enough, we can see a common ancestor between mammals and birds, between mammals and alligators, between mammals and fish. And we can find a common ancestor with all of life and all living things. So this last little slide is actually a very simple phylogenetic tree or tree of life or evolutionary tree, whatever you want to call it. And I know I'm coming up right on 15 minutes, so I'll make this pretty quick, and we'll definitely look at this in class. But the very bottom dot, that represents the very first bacteria cell to ever exist. And we can see all the different branches. The branches that are very close together mean that they're very closely related. So, for example, if you look at the very top middle where the human is, you see a gorilla-looking shape. I think that's supposed to be a gorilla. And we are very closely linked. But if you look at a human and where a bird is, our connection is much further off. Or if you look at where a human is and a tree or a land plant, we are very far off. So phylogenetic trees can show you just how closely you're related to other species. And that's going to do it. I know this was a little bit longer. We're coming up on 15 and a half minutes. So I'll let you all go. Enjoy the rest of your night. And today's secret phrase is red touches yellow, kill a fellow. Have a wonderful night.